Good afternoon, everyone. This is Professor Hills, a short video for our class, Introduction to Ethics, Philosophy 2306 here at St. Philip's College for the Maymester of 2023. We're in week 3, the last week of our short, condensed class for Maymester. Today is Wednesday, the 31st of May, the last day of May, the last Wednesday in our class. And we are looking ahead to the day after tomorrow, Friday, because that's when our last essay is going to be. And this class will come to an end. And so we're looking this week at a different source of authority. And authority, I had a couple of students ask me this. It just means in our lives, there are lots of different sources, from parents when we're young, to teachers, to coaches, to religious figures, pastors, priests, rabbis, who explain to us some moral codes, some moral rules, and they act as a source of authority and lay out what you can and cannot do. Sometimes they're just referring you to like the law and says, this is what the law says you can and cannot do. Sometimes they're referring to a moral code, a moral theory, again, saying what you kind of can and cannot do. But we get into an interesting one here this week, talking about IHL, International Humanitarian Law. This is the international law around the armed conflict. This is like the Geneva Conventions. These are people familiar with the Geneva Conventions. This is the source of authority that says when armed conflict arises, you can't do some things like shoot prisoners or bomb hospitals. There are rules, even during war, you cannot violate. And so it's an interesting thing because it's evolved over time from an old law of arms, which was kind of based in chivalry hundreds of years ago, where again, there was always an interest in combating combatants, meaning the different states. You know, England's fighting France for the umpteenth time. And they do have, for example, an interest in making sure that your troops, when they're captured and taken prisoner, that they're treated well and respected and not summarily executed. And the best way you can ensure that is to treat well and not summarily execute the prisoners that you take on the battlefield. And so there was this kind of joint mutual interest that gets codified into agreements and custom, and then later gets formalized down into written international treaties, into the law of arms, and it becomes modern day international humanitarian law. So now we have conventions, we have optional protocols, we have agreements, and the United Nations helped to be a forum where countries can come together and talk and discuss and negotiate these things. The International Committee of the Red Cross has a unique role as kind of the sponsors of IHL. And they have, because they are seen and viewed as the independent, they're kind of the Switzerland of armed conflict, meaning that they're the neutrals. They have to be seen as being trustworthy if they're going to be able to come in, and each side is going to trust them to do things like inspect POW camps, that kind of stuff. Well, they have this kind of unique role, which for great historical reasons. And there's a short video in the module about the formation of the Red Cross and how they ended up with this unique role as kind of the respected neutrals who can both develop new IHL, but also have this role inside as kind of the referees or the umpires, right? They're not again, they don't have a political interest in like solving conflict. They're not the ones who are trying to negotiate with the parties to stop the war. That's not their thing. There are diplomats for that. There are other mechanisms for that. So they say, look, we don't have a dog in this fight. We're just here to make sure that the rights of the human beings in this conflict are respected in accordance with international humanitarian law. So that's their role. Now, we're going to see as we look at some of the, again, we don't want to try to tackle all of international humanitarian law. We're only going to focus on this one small issue about the Convention on the Rights of the Child and this optional protocol about children and their role in armed conflict, and the effort to try to develop what was called the straight 18, meaning nobody below 18, children, would be involved directly in hostilities and conflict, be combatants, soldiers. That was the idea. It was a long struggle. And as you can see from some of the materials, a few countries pushed back, notably, famously, the United States pushed back against that and said, no, we want to be able to still have children in our military and in combat. We were the big obstacle. We finally struck the deal, and you can see it in the materials, where the Secretary of State Madeleine Albright negotiated a compromise where the military would just have to take all feasible measures. This kind of, we're going to take reasonable steps to try to comply. But if short of that, if we did, exhaust all feasible measures to keep the 17-year-olds out of conflict, then there would be essentially exceptions under the protocol for our military. I got this question a lot when I would teach on the military bases here in San Antonio. I'd go to Fort Sam, I'd go to Lackland, and I'd say, we're members, we don't have child soldiers. And then I say to my students, how many people here were in Afghanistan or Iraq at 17? And, a bunch of hands go up. So it's still, and if you look, they still do reports on this to this day. Still lots of child soldiers out there, and by state actors like the United States. It's I wish it wasn't as commonplace as it is. But look, it is a complicated issue, one with a long tradition of using children as soldiers, and there are reasons of military necessity that the Pentagon has consistently pushed forward, as saying, look, we need to be able to recruit and even conscript 16, 17-year-olds into the military and have them be combatants in direct hostilities. Now what they're saying is they're going to try to take these reasonable steps to limit them. All feasible measures. It turns out, though, however, like that
Wi-Fi network isn't connected to the internet.
Yeah, I bet. Thanks.
Take a look at the help section in your.
Sorry, our friend over there wants to get involved. But it turns out that we're going to look at IHL as a source of authority, but we're making an ethical choice. We're here talking about ethics. I want to know what your moral judgment is about the use of child soldiers. And then why? Because this does get right to the heart of our issue about consequentialist and non-consequentialist and your approach to this. So I don't want to know just what's your view on this. Should the U.S. be able to have child soldiers? Or are you opposed to that morally, ethically? And if so, why? What's your rationale for that? I hope it's informed by the IHL, but you might have a moral judgment which is based on something else. Maybe it's based on some Kantian ethical structure where you think it's just there are moral principles which make it unacceptable, or in your case, your judgment, acceptable to have child soldiers. You might be approaching this from a cultural relativistic point of view. You might want to talk about how different cultures and different countries, by the way, in the negotiations, is a lot about how the different countries came to the negotiations with different attitudes about the use of child soldiers and why. That's an interesting piece of this conversation. But those are the questions that you need to answer this time around. Look at the case of Calvin Graham. It's an interesting case. And I'll talk tomorrow a little bit about the Chinese farmer and the horse and how it's difficult in this case to determine using consequentialism whether or not you think Calvin Graham did something. What he did was either good or bad, because it keeps kind of shifting, kind of like the story of the horse. Anyway, that's for tomorrow. Today, just wanted to make sure that we're on the same page about introducing IHL as a source of authority, but we're not looking for a legal opinion from you as an international lawyer. I want to know your moral, ethical judgment on this and what's it based on. So tell me whether you think the use of child soldiers is good or bad, and then tell me why. As I mentioned in my last couple of videos, that's the important part, being able to describe your moral thinking in the terms of the chapters we've been looking at, in terms of our textbook, Doing Ethics by Louis Vaughn. That's the important thing. All right, get to it. Day after tomorrow, Friday. That sounds close all of a sudden. So we're wrapping it up. Make sure that you get to those essays and you make sure you've got all of this in there. And again, as always, if you need me, contact me. I'm sitting here at the office. So reach out to me if I can be of any help. Take care. Bye.